The night sky stretched over a world both familiar and alien. In the mind's eye, continents were not as they are today, where shallow coastal plains now lie buried beneath waves, forests once breathed in the warm light of the sun, great rivers wound their way through fertile valleys, and cities, or something like cities, may have stood along their banks. But the record of these places, if they ever existed, is drowned beneath hundreds of feet of ocean water, locked away in darkness and silence. Somewhere in humanity's deep past a cataclysm came. It was not the slow, creeping change of time that transforms mountains into dust. It was sudden, merciless, and beyond human resistance. Waters rose, whether in a single terrible season or in waves of devastation over centuries, no one can say with certainty. Ancient storytellers, scattered across every continent, spoke of it as a great flood, a deluge so vast it erased whole worlds. Civilizations, if they stood, were scoured from the land like chalk from a slate. Today, much of the world's population lives along coastlines. But in the distant past, the shore was not where it is now. At the end of the last ice age, sea levels were as much as 120 meters lower. Vast tracts of land, now submerged, would have been prime ground for human settlement, temperate, fertile, rich in fish and game. When the ice sheets collapsed and the waters surged, these lands were lost. Along with them may have gone evidence of cultures whose memory lingers only as myth. The story you're about to hear is not a simple one of fact and fiction, truth and legend. It winds between established science and the echoes of human imagination. It is a mosaic made from archaeology, geology, oral tradition, and hypothesis, pieces that do not always fit together neatly. Yet they invite us to wonder, what if we are not the first to walk the earth with knowledge and ambition? What if entire chapters of our story lie unread beneath the sea? So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I'm doing here. And if you wish, share your location and your local time in the comments. The story will wait. Beneath the ruins of modern cities and far beyond the oldest surviving monuments lie fragments of the planet's deep memory. In clay tablets dug from Mesopotamian soil, in carvings on weathered stone, and in the whispered traditions of peoples far removed from one another, there is a shared rhythm, the tale of a flood. It is a story that may have been told for more than 10,000 years, passed through generations not as idle fantasy, but as a warning and a remembrance. Historians still debate whether such myths reflect a single catastrophic event, or many smaller ones stitched together over time. Some point to the Sumerian king list, which records rulers reigning for impossibly long spans before a great deluge swept them away. Others draw attention to the Epic of Gilgamesh, where the hero meets Utnapishtim, the flood survivor whose tale closely parallels the later biblical Noah. These parallels suggest either a common origin or a deep human tendency to frame disaster as divine judgment and renewal. Yet there are details in these stories that resist easy explanation. Why do cultures separated by oceans, from the islands of Polynesia to the highlands of the Andes, describe waters swallowing mountains? Why do some include vivid references to stars shifting in the sky or the sun darkening? The factual event here is clear. The Earth's climate changed dramatically at the end of the Pleistocene. Vast ice sheets melted, seas rose, and coastlines retreated inland by hundreds of kilometers in some regions. The strange event lies in the apparent global consistency of the flood myth, preserved in places where no written language existed until recently. One hypothesis gaining traction in fringe but persistent circles is that advanced coastal civilizations thrived during the last glacial period, exploiting shorelines rich in resources. When the sea rose, their cities and technologies vanished beneath the waves, leaving only hints in surviving inland sites and in seafloor anomalies detected by sonar. While mainstream archaeology finds no hard proof of such advanced Ice Age cultures, the absence of evidence, they admit, is not necessarily evidence of absence, particularly when most of the relevant terrain is underwater. This is where the story begins, not with certainty, but with an open question. It begins with the possibility that the world we see today is only a remnant of the world that once was, a highland refuge left after lowlands drowned. It begins with the recognition that human history may be far older and far stranger than our textbooks allow. In the soft darkness of prehistory, the waters are still rising. Long before paper, before ink, before bound books lined the shelves of libraries, the Sumerians pressed their stories into wet clay. These tablets, baked in the heat of the Mesopotamian sun, or hardened by the fires of destruction, have endured for more than 4,000 years. In them is the deluge, a narrative so central to the Sumerian worldview that it threads through their mythology, history, and even their lists of kings. The Sumerian king list is not, at first glance, a mythological text. It is presented as a chronicle of rulers, beginning with legendary reigns of thousands of years each, and continuing into the more modestly spanned lifetimes of later kings. Yet, in the middle, a break occurs. Then the flood swept over. After the flood had swept over and the kingship had descended from heaven, kingship was in Kish. That line is abrupt, but it carries a weight of finality, as though an entire era had been washed away, leaving only scattered survivors to begin anew. Archaeologists have long debated whether this flood was a literal event or a metaphor for societal collapse. The factual event behind such speculation is clear. The region of southern Mesopotamia experienced periodic flooding from the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. These floods were sometimes catastrophic, displacing populations, reshaping the land, and burying settlements under thick layers of silt. In the ancient city of Shuruppak, excavations revealed a distinct deposit, nearly 2 meters of river clay, dating to around 2900 BCE. Above it, the style of pottery and architecture changed abruptly, suggesting a cultural rupture. This has led some scholars to hypothesize that a particularly devastating regional flood may have inspired the Sumerian deluge tradition. Yet the myth, like all good stories, seems larger than life. In the Eridu Genesis, another Sumerian text, the gods decide to destroy humankind with a flood, sparing only Ziusudra, a righteous man instructed to build a great boat. The parallels with the later Akkadian story of Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh and with the biblical Noah are striking. Historians still debate whether these are all versions of a shared Mesopotamian tradition that spread outward, or whether the flood motif emerged independently in many cultures because floods are among the most universal of human disasters. But there is another, stranger aspect to the Sumerian flood narratives. They speak not only of human survival, but of the loss of something greater, a kingship that descended from heaven and was interrupted by the waters. To the Sumerians, kingship was more than political authority. It was a divine gift, a sign of civilization itself. In the gap left by the flood, some interpreters see an echo of an earlier forgotten age. Could this be a fragment of a much older memory, passed down through oral tradition from a time before Mesopotamia's own rise? Here the historical fact and the hypothesis diverge. The fact: the earliest written flood myths we possess are Sumerian, and they appear to be rooted in real environmental events. The hypothesis: these texts may be the last surviving threads of an even older story, one that predates the emergence of writing by thousands of years and perhaps originated among peoples living far from Mesopotamia's riverbanks. If such a story existed, it might have travelled with migrating populations, reshaping itself to fit new landscapes and new pantheons. One off-topic yet revealing event from Mesopotamian history illustrates the fragility of records, the destruction of libraries by war. The library of Ashurbanipal, though much later than the Sumerians, contained many ancient texts. When Nineveh fell in 612 BCE, fires baked some tablets hard enough to preserve them for millennia, while others were shattered or lost entirely. This accident of preservation reminds us how much of the ancient world's knowledge, especially if it existed in perishable form, could vanish with a single catastrophe. It is tempting to imagine that the Sumerian flood tablets are survivors of a much deeper current of memory. The image of a lone figure in a boat, carrying seeds and animals, has an archetypal weight that feels almost too vivid to have been invented from nothing. Yet mainstream historians caution against seeing too much in such parallels. Floods happen, and human minds are skilled at turning trauma into story. Still, the enduring nature of the Sumerian accounts suggests that they struck a chord, one that resonated far beyond Mesopotamia. The next echoes of this chord are found not in river valleys, but in the geological layers of a world shifting violently at the close of the last ice age. If the Sumerians remembered a flood, perhaps others, living in distant lands at the same time, remembered something far greater, not the swelling of rivers, but the rising of seas. And so the story flows onward, from the clay of ancient tablets to the ice-bound expanses of a world on the edge of transformation. At the waning edge of the last ice age, Earth stood at the threshold of transformation. Vast white continents of ice stretched across the northern hemisphere, their weight pressing down on the crust. The world's climate was locked in a precarious balance. Then, in what geologists call the Younger Dryas, that balance was shattered. This period, lasting roughly from 12,900 to 11,700 years ago, remains one of the most abrupt climatic shifts in the geological record, a sudden reversion to near-glacial conditions just as the planet was beginning to warm. The factual sequence is known. Temperatures plummeted within a matter of decades, reshaping ecosystems, halting the spread of forests, and driving some species, such as the woolly mammoth, toward extinction. But the cause remains debated. One widely discussed hypothesis is that a sudden influx of fresh meltwater from retreating ice sheets flooded into the North Atlantic, disrupting the ocean's thermohaline circulation. This, in turn, could have triggered a rapid cooling. Another, far more controversial idea suggests that the Younger Dryas began with a cosmic impact, perhaps a comet or fragments of one striking the ice sheets of North America. Advocates of this theory point to a thin, dark layer found at archaeological and geological sites across multiple continents, rich in microscopic carbon spherules, nanodiamonds, and high-temperature minerals. These, they argue, are signs of an extraterrestrial explosion or collision. Mainstream scientists remain cautious. The evidence, they say, is intriguing but far from conclusive. Historians still debate whether the Younger Dryas cooling was caused by such an event, by meltwater pulses, or by a combination of multiple factors. Regardless of cause, the period's end, around 11,700 years ago, marked one of the most dramatic sea level rises in human prehistory. As ice sheets collapsed, vast torrents of meltwater poured into the oceans. Some of these discharges were sudden and catastrophic. In the geological record, they appear as meltwater pulses, with sea levels jumping several meters in just centuries, perhaps even decades. Imagine standing on a coastline and seeing the sea creep inland year after year, swallowing fields, forests, and villages. If advanced coastal settlements had existed in this period, their destruction would have been almost inevitable. Wooden structures would decay without trace. Stone buildings, if any, might survive, but they would be buried under silt and sand or drowned beneath hundreds of meters of water. Today, much of the continental shelf lies in this drowned zone, inaccessible without costly underwater archaeology. An off-topic but relevant geological parallel can be found in the story of the Strega Slides off Norway's coast. Around 8,200 years ago, massive undersea landslides sent towering tsunamis crashing into the shores of Scotland, Greenland, and beyond. These waves destroyed coastal ecosystems and may have wiped out settlements. While this happened millennia after the Younger Dryas, it shows how abruptly and violently the sea can reshape human history, even without global ice sheets in play. The Younger Dryas also intersects with archaeology in another curious way. Some of the oldest known human structures in the world appear within a few centuries after its end. Sites like Gobekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, with its monumental stone pillars carved with animals and symbols, date to around 11,600 years ago, just as the world was emerging from this climatic turmoil. Could such sites be the work of survivors rebuilding after environmental collapse? Mainstream archaeology sees Gobekli Tepe as the product of hunter-gatherers, experimenting with new forms of social organisation, not as the remnant of a lost high civilization. But the timing is suggestive, and it has inspired speculation that the knowledge to create such sites may have been preserved from an earlier, now vanished culture. From a climatological perspective, the Younger Dryas ended almost as abruptly as it began. In the Greenland ice cores, the shift from cold to warm appears within a human lifetime, a transformation so rapid that entire regions would have faced collapsing food chains, displaced animal herds, and flooding landscapes. This would have forced migrations on a massive scale. Populations clustered along now vanished coastlines would have had no choice but to move inland, perhaps carrying with them only fragments of their culture and oral traditions. Over time, these stories could have evolved into the flood myths that still echo around the globe. One hypothesis gaining interest among cross-disciplinary researchers is that the memory of rising seas became fused with memories of more localized floods and tsunamis. This could explain why flood myths often mix elements of long-term inundation with sudden, overwhelming waves. In such stories, the slow advance of the ocean might be remembered as a single terrifying day when the waters came. Memory compresses time. Oral tradition reshapes geology into drama. What makes the Younger Dryas particularly important to the story of lost civilizations is its position in the timeline. It sits at the boundary between the Paleolithic and the beginnings of settled agriculture. Conventional history sees this period as the dawn of human civilization. The speculative view asks, what if it was not a beginning, but a recovery? If even one advanced society, advanced in the sense of complex architecture, trade or technology, beyond what we attribute to hunter-gatherers, had existed in coastal regions during the last ice age, the Younger Dryas flooding could have erased it almost without trace. The difficulty is that direct proof is elusive. Underwater archaeology has recovered submerged Stone Age sites in places like the North Sea's Doggerland and the Black Sea's ancient shores, but nothing yet that suggests high technology or state-level organisation in that deep past. Still, the planet's vast submerged landscapes remain largely unexplored. Modern mapping has covered only a fraction of the seafloor in detail. Vast stretches of continental shelf could hide ruins we have not yet imagined. There is also the matter of human migration patterns. Genetic studies suggest that human populations were already widely dispersed by 15,000 years ago, with settlements in the Americas, Eurasia, and Australia. Many of these early communities would have clustered near coastlines for access to resources. When those coasts drowned, the survivors would have moved inland, carrying their skills and myths. But inland refuges may not have supported the same complexity as the rich coastal zones, leading to a regression in technology and social organisation. In this reading, the Younger Dryas and its floods were not merely natural disasters, they were a civilizational bottleneck, reducing humanity to a scattering of groups rebuilding in a changed world. The grand monuments and kingdoms of recorded history may then be only the second flowering of human culture, the first having been swallowed by the sea. As the Younger Dryas fades into the Holocene warmth, the archaeological trail leads us toward the first monumental architecture we know, and toward questions about what kind of knowledge survived the deluge. High on a limestone ridge in southeastern Turkey, far from the sea that once lapped at the edges of Ice Age plains, stands a site that has unsettled the timelines of archaeology. Gobekli Tepe is not merely old, it is ancient beyond the founding of cities, the invention of pottery, or the domestication of most staple crops. Radiocarbon dating places its earliest construction around 9,600 BCE, roughly 11,600 years ago, coinciding almost exactly with the end of the Younger Dryas and the onset of the Holocene's warmer climate. This site is composed of massive circular enclosures, each formed by towering T-shaped limestone pillars, some more than 5 meters high and weighing up to 10 tons. Many are carved with reliefs of animals: foxes, snakes, boars, vultures. Others bear abstract symbols whose meaning remains elusive. The craftsmanship is extraordinary, especially for a time when, according to conventional history, humans were still living in small, mobile hunter-gatherer groups. Mainstream archaeology interprets Gobekli Tepe as a ceremonial or ritual centre, built by coordinated groups of foragers before the spread of settled farming. Yet the scale of the work, the quarrying, the transport, the precise shaping of the pillars, has led some researchers to suggest that the builders possessed organisational skills and technical knowledge well beyond what was assumed for their era. Historians still debate whether the site represents an independent leap forward in social complexity or the revival of techniques learned from an earlier, now-vanished tradition. One of the most curious aspects of Gobekli Tepe is that it was intentionally buried around 8000 BCE. The reason remains unknown. Some hypothesize it was a ritual closure, a symbolic end to its purpose. Others suggest it was covered to protect it, perhaps against threats, whether from environmental change, social upheaval, or enemies. The deliberate burial, however, ensured its preservation for millennia, locking away its secrets until modern excavation began in the 1990s. The factual anchor here is that Gobekli Tepe predates both Stonehenge and the Egyptian pyramids by thousands of years. This challenges the long-held assumption that monumental architecture emerged only after agriculture created permanent settlements and surplus labour. Instead, it suggests that large-scale construction may have been a catalyst for social change rather than its product. A strange but telling parallel lies far from Anatolia, in the ancient Andean site of Caral in Peru. While much younger, dating to around 2600 BCE, Caral also shows evidence of large ceremonial architecture arising in a context that does not fit neatly into the traditional agricultural first model. Though the two sites are separated by continents and millennia, they raise the same question. Do we underestimate the organisational capabilities of early cultures, or are we glimpsing scattered remnants of a knowledge base carried forward from an even earlier epoch? The hypothesis often whispered around Gobekli Tepe is that it could be the work of descendants of a culture erased by the end of the Ice Age. These survivors, displaced from drowned coasts or fertile lowlands, may have settled inland, bringing with them fragments of their former skills. In this reading, the site could represent an attempt to re-establish ceremonial centres that once stood in now submerged lands. Mainstream archaeologists resist the leap to such conclusions, emphasising that no definitive evidence links Gobekli Tepe to a lost civilization. Yet they acknowledge that the transition from the Younger Dryas to the Holocene was a period of extraordinary change, environmental, social and possibly cultural, and that sites like this are rare windows into that transformation. From an engineering perspective, Gobekli Tepe's construction required more than just brute strength. The stone pillars were quarried from bedrock, shaped with stone tools, and transported short distances using methods we can only infer. The arrangement of the enclosures suggests deliberate orientation, perhaps astronomical. Some researchers have proposed alignments with certain stars or constellations, as they appeared in the sky around 9600 BCE. While these interpretations are controversial, they invite comparisons to later megalithic sites, where celestial observation was intertwined with ritual. One off-topic yet fascinating note in the study of Gobekli Tepe is the discovery of tools and debris from daily life around the site. Flint points, animal bones, grinding stones. These finds indicate that people did not simply visit to perform ceremonies and leave. There were periods of prolonged activity, perhaps even seasonal habitation. This blurs the line between ceremonial centre and settlement, making the site's role in its society even harder to pin down. The sheer age of Gobekli Tepe also forces a reconsideration of the narrative arc of human development. If people could organise labour, coordinate design, and execute large-scale stone construction before farming villages dotted the landscape, then what other achievements might have been possible in the more temperate, resource-rich zones now lost to the sea? The hypothesis here is provocative. Perhaps the traditional ladder of progress, from foraging to farming to cities to monuments, is not a universal path, but a reconstruction based on the fragmentary evidence we have from the few areas where conditions preserved ancient remains. Historians still debate whether agriculture was a prerequisite for complex architecture, or whether, as Gobekli Tepe hints, monumental construction could itself have driven the development of agriculture. One speculative model proposes that large ceremonial gatherings required reliable food supplies, encouraging the domestication of plants and animals to support the builders and participants. If true, then the end of the Younger Dryas may have sparked not just environmental change, but a feedback loop between cultural ambition and technological adaptation. In the quiet today, standing among the excavated pillars, one can imagine the ridge as it was 12,000 years ago, a place of gathering for people who may have carried, in memory or tradition, the remnants of a drowned world. Whether they were innovators breaking new ground or inheritors of a lost heritage, their work has endured as one of the oldest surviving monuments to human ingenuity. From here, the narrative turns toward the sea, again following the ancient shorelines where similar stories may lie hidden. For while Gobekli Tepe rests on dry land, many of its possible contemporaries may now lie far beneath the waves, and it is along those submerged coasts that the next pieces of the puzzle emerge, places where the ocean itself guards the ruins of the past. Along the present-day coast of India, the Arabian Sea laps against sandy shores where fishing boats rest on the tide. Beneath those waters, in the shallows and deeper zones beyond the continental shelf, lie shapes that do not belong entirely to nature. Submerged stone alignments, walls, and geometric patterns have been mapped in certain areas, most famously near the city of Dwarka in Gujarat and in the Gulf of Comet. These sites have drawn intense curiosity, not only from archaeologists but from those who suspect they may be fragments of cities that stood before the seas claimed them. The most widely known of these underwater discoveries came in 2001, when a survey by the National Institute of Ocean Technology in the Gulf of Comet detected unusual patterns on the seabed using side-scan sonar. The mapped shapes resembled streets and foundations stretching for several kilometres. Divers recovered artefacts including stone tools and materials identified as wood, some of which were later radiocarbon dated to as much as 9,500 years old. If these dates are accurate, and they remain contested, the structures would predate the rise of the Indus Valley civilization by several millennia. The factual anchor is that India's coastline, like many others, was far inland during the last ice age. Between 20,000 and 7,000 years ago, sea levels rose dramatically, submerging low-lying areas. This means that any settlements along those ancient shores would now be underwater. The question is whether the features observed off Gujarat and elsewhere are truly human-made or simply geological formations shaped by currents and erosion. Historians still debate whether the sonar images represent ruins or natural ridges, and whether the recovered artifacts were deposited there by ancient peoples or transported later by river and tide. One of the strange, off-topic but telling events in modern Indian history that mirrors these debates is the fate of Mahabalipuram's 7 pagodas on the southeastern coast. Long a legend in local tradition, the story claimed that 6 of the city's great temples were swallowed by the sea, leaving only one standing on shore. In 2004, when the Indian Ocean tsunami briefly drew back the waters, stone structures became visible offshore before the waves returned, confirming that at least part of the legend had a basis in fact. Though these ruins date to the medieval period, they remind us how coastal memory can preserve the reality of submersion for centuries or millennia. The hypothesis that gains traction among some researchers is that India's submerged sites may preserve traces of late Ice Age or early Holocene cultures that lived in coastal plains now lost. These people may have been the ancestors or cultural forerunners of later civilizations, passing down maritime skills, navigation knowledge, and perhaps even certain symbolic traditions. If so, the rising seas of the early Holocene may have driven migrations inland, leading to the florescence of settlements along new rivers and trade routes. From a geological standpoint, the Indian subcontinent's coast is a dynamic environment. River deltas shift, silt buries sites, and tectonic activity can raise or lower entire stretches of land. This makes the interpretation of underwater structures challenging. In some cases, naturally fractured bedrock can produce right angles and straight lines that resemble human construction. Only detailed excavation, which is logistically difficult and expensive underwater, can settle such questions. In the case of Dwarka, later underwater exploration found stone blocks and anchors, some dating to the early historic period, confirming that parts of the ancient city had indeed been lost to the sea in more recent centuries. But the deeper features, lying far beyond the modern harbour, remain more mysterious. If they are truly as old as 9,000 or 10,000 years, they would place organised settlement in the region well before the accepted timeline of urban development. The cultural resonance of these finds is profound. Indian traditions preserve numerous flood narratives, from the Satapatha Brahmana's tale of Manu, a virtuous man warned by a fish of an impending deluge, to local legends tied to specific coastal sites. These stories often blend cosmic imagery with very grounded details, such as the submergence of temples, towns, or fertile plains. Some scholars see in them the memory of post-ice age sea level rise, refracted through centuries of retelling. Others argue they are purely symbolic, meant to convey moral or cosmological lessons. Historians still debate whether such myths preserve literal memories or are retrofitted to explain ruins encountered later. Yet in places like Gujarat, where submerged stonework can be touched by divers today, the line between legend and archaeology blurs in ways that make both sides of the argument compelling. A curious modern analogy to this interplay of story and site comes from the Japanese coast, where the Yonaguni Monument, a massive underwater rock formation, has been argued by some to be man-made, though most geologists see it as natural. There, as in India, the debate revolves around whether sharp-edged formations are the work of human hands or the patient chiselling of natural forces. If the Gulf of Khambhat structures are indeed ancient urban remains, they would force a re-evaluation of South Asia's prehistory, pushing back organised settlement by thousands of years. If they are natural, the mystery of India's drowned coasts remains, but the answer shifts toward lost landscapes rather than lost civilizations. In either case, the region's submerged shelf holds chapters of history not yet read. The logistical challenges of underwater archaeology mean that only fragments of these submerged worlds have been examined. Visibility is often poor, currents are strong, and sediments shift over time, burying sites deeper. But as technology improves, with better submersible drones, 3D mapping, and sediment analysis, the prospect of unlocking these underwater archives grows more realistic. The hypothesis favoured by those who suspect erased civilizations is that such technology will eventually reveal not just scattered artefacts, but whole districts, harbours, or ceremonial centres. In that vision, the coasts of India are not merely a fringe of the known ancient world, but a gateway to its lost heartlands. From the shallows of Gujarat, the narrative will now turn outward to the farthest oceans, to see whether the story of the flood is written not just in one region's drowned ruins, but in the shared mythscape of humanity. For across the planet, from the Pacific to the Arctic, other voices echo the same refrain: the waters came, and the world before was gone. Across the continents and islands of the world, in the songs of elders and the carvings of ancient temples, the story of a great flood recurs with uncanny persistence. This is not a single tale transplanted from one culture to another, like a seed carried on the wind. It is a chorus of voices that arose in isolation, separated by oceans and mountains, yet all speaking of waters that rose and swallowed the land. The persistence of these myths has led scholars to question whether they are purely symbolic or whether they preserve memories of real, catastrophic events. In the highlands of the Andes, the Quechua people tell of Unu Pachacuti, the water that overturns the earth. In this story, the gods send a flood to cleanse the world of corruption, sparing only a few chosen survivors. Far across the Pacific, in the islands of Polynesia, legends speak of Tauhaki or Nu'u, who built a great canoe to escape rising seas. Among the Ojibwe of North America, there is the tale of the earth being remade after a flood, with animals diving into the depths to retrieve mud from which land was reborn. These stories differ in their details, but they share striking motifs: divine warning or intervention, a chosen survivor, the preservation of seeds or animals, and a world reshaped by the receding waters. The factual event that may underlie many of them is the post-Ice Age sea level rise, a global phenomenon that transformed coastlines everywhere. Between roughly 20,000 and 7,000 years ago, the oceans rose more than 120 metres, flooding continental shelves that had been dry land for tens of thousands of years. Historians still debate whether flood myths are independent inventions inspired by local disasters, or if they originate from a smaller set of shared stories carried by migrating peoples. The possibility of shared origin is supported by the clustering of certain narrative elements, such as the righteous man warned by a supernatural being, in widely separated cultures. Yet the case for independent invention is equally strong. Floods are among the most common and devastating events faced by pre-modern communities, making them a natural subject for myth-making. One strange but revealing example of how myth and fact intertwine comes from Aboriginal Australia. Along the country's northern coast, some indigenous groups preserve oral traditions describing the sea flooding their lands, naming now submerged landmarks with remarkable accuracy. Recent studies have shown that these stories may date back more than 7,000 years, making them some of the oldest continuous oral histories on Earth. In this case, myth is not merely metaphor. It is a cultural memory of real geographic change. The hypothesis that emerges from such evidence is that oral traditions can preserve genuine historical events far longer than once thought, especially when those events are tied to sacred or identity-forming narratives. If flood myths around the world are indeed cultural memories of post-Ice Age inundations, then they represent one of humanity's most enduring shared experiences, a deep time trauma carried forward in story. From a comparative mythology perspective, flood narratives often cluster with other world renewal myths, such as tales of fire, darkness, or cosmic battles. In some traditions, the flood is not the first catastrophe, but the latest in a cycle of destructions and rebirths. This aligns with the belief, found in both ancient Mesopotamia and Mesoamerica, that humanity has lived through multiple ages, or suns, each ending in a different disaster. While mainstream historians treat these cycles as symbolic, those who favour the lost civilization hypothesis see them as garbled records of real, sequential cataclysms, floods being only one type. The factual thread remains. Massive flooding events did occur in many parts of the world during the transition from the Ice Age. In North America, the collapse of the Laurentide ice sheet released enormous volumes of water into the oceans. In Southeast Asia, the melting of glaciers drowned the Sunda Shelf, transforming the region's geography into the island chains we see today. In Europe, the retreat of ice flooded the plains of what is now the North Sea. Each of these events would have been apocalyptic to the people who lived through them. A curious off-topic but illuminating case comes from the 19th century, when missionary John Williams recorded Polynesian oral histories of long voyages over drowned lands. At the time, these were dismissed as fanciful, yet modern bathymetric mapping has revealed shallow plateaus and ridges beneath the ocean surface that match, in rough outline, the directions given in the stories. Whether this is coincidence or a sign of deep navigational memory remains unresolved. Scholars of oral tradition note that the accuracy of such memories depends on how they are woven into a culture's identity. A flood story told as a moral parable may drift in detail over centuries, while a flood story tied to place names, ritual reenactments, and navigation routes can remain remarkably stable. This opens the possibility that certain flood myths are not merely symbolic, but precise, place-based accounts of real sea level rise and land loss. The lost civilization hypothesis fits here by suggesting that some of these traditions may describe not only environmental change, but the destruction of complex societies. The survivors, scattered and reduced in number, would have passed down stories of the world they had lost. Cities swallowed by the sea, harbours gone, fertile plains turned to shallow bays. Over time, the stories would evolve, layering divine motives and symbolic imagery over the fading memory of the actual event. Historians still debate whether any archaeological evidence supports the existence of such advanced coastal societies before the known river valley civilizations. The main challenge is that the most promising locations for such evidence, the now submerged continental shelves, remain largely unexplored. Underwater archaeology is expensive, and research often focuses on shipwrecks and more recent submerged sites, leaving deep prehistory in the shadows. And yet, as more discoveries emerge, from submerged stone circles off the coast of Scotland to ancient middens beneath the waters of British Columbia, the possibility of finding older, more complex remains grows. Each new site forces a reconsideration of how long human societies have been building, trading, and organising in ways we might call civilized. The global flood myth is not a single story, but a tapestry woven from many threads. Some are local, born of a river overflowing its banks. Some are regional, remembering a tsunami that erased villages in a single night. And some perhaps are continental, memories of the oceans themselves rising to reclaim the land. Whether these stories arose independently or share a deep common root, they remain among the most persistent expressions of humanity's relationship with the forces that shape our world. From these myths, we move to one of the most dramatic geological proposals of the last century, a theory that ties a specific regional flood to the birth of ancient civilizations along the shores of a sea that was once a lake. The Black Sea deluge hypothesis awaits. On the map of modern Europe and Asia, the Black Sea sits like a dark, landlocked jewel. But around 8,000 years ago, it may not have been a sea at all, at least not in the form we know today. Geologists believe it was once a vast freshwater lake, fed by rivers flowing down from the surrounding mountains. The Black Sea deluge hypothesis proposes that its transformation into a saltwater basin was sudden, catastrophic, and possibly the source of some of the world's most enduring flood legends. The theory gained prominence in the late 1990s when marine geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman examined sediment cores from the Black Sea floor. Their findings suggested a sharp change in salinity and marine life around 5,600 BCE. The factual reconstruction they proposed is dramatic. At the end of the last ice age, global sea levels rose as glaciers melted. The Mediterranean, higher than the Black Sea basin, pressed against the natural land barrier of the Bosporus Strait. Then, one day, the barrier gave way. According to their model, seawater from the Mediterranean cascaded into the Black Sea basin with incredible force, perhaps 200 times the volume of Niagara Falls, flooding vast areas of previously inhabited land. In some reconstructions, the shoreline advanced inland at the rate of 1 kilometre or more per day. Villages, farms, and hunting grounds would have been swallowed by the encroaching saltwater in a matter of months. The factual event here is that sea levels did indeed rise globally during this period, and the Black Sea did shift from fresh water to salt water. What remains under debate is the speed and scale of that change. Some geologists argue for a gradual inundation over centuries, not a sudden deluge. Others challenge the dating or suggest that the catastrophic model overstates the evidence. Historians still debate whether the Black Sea flood was a local event or a regional disaster with far-reaching cultural consequences. From an archaeological perspective, The hypothesis gains intrigue from the discovery of submerged structures along the modern Black Sea coastline. In 2000, marine archaeologists led by Robert Ballard, known for finding the wreck of the Titanic, located what appeared to be ancient shorelines, complete with freshwater mollusk shells dated to around 7,500 years ago. Near one of these shorelines, they found wooden structures that may have been part of a small settlement. If confirmed, these would be direct evidence that humans lived along the lake's edge before it became a sea. A strange and seemingly unrelated yet illuminating comparison can be drawn to the flooding of the Three Gorges region in modern China. When the dam was completed in 2003, entire towns were submerged and millions relocated. This modern engineering project offers a small-scale glimpse of what ancient peoples might have experienced, a landscape that once defined their lives erased beneath a new and alien body of water. The emotional and cultural dislocation would have been immense. One hypothesis emerging from the Black Sea deluge model is that displaced populations may have migrated southward and westward into Anatolia, the Aegean, and beyond, carrying with them not only their agricultural practices but also their flood stories. Some scholars speculate that these migrants could have been among the peoples who contributed to the rise of early farming societies in southeastern Europe and the Near East. The biblical story of Noah, the Mesopotamian Utnapishtim, and even certain Greek myths of Deucalion and Pyrrha could, in this interpretation, all trace their ancestry to this shared trauma. However, mainstream historians and archaeologists urge caution. The connection between the Black Sea flood and specific myths is speculative. Oral traditions can preserve memories for millennia, but they can also merge events, embellish details, and shift geography. The most responsible conclusion for now is that the Black Sea flood, whether sudden or slow, was one of many regional inundations that marked the end of the Ice Age, and that it could have contributed to, but not solely created, the global flood myth tradition. From a geological standpoint, the Bosporus Strait is an unstable threshold, vulnerable to both tectonic shifts and erosion. This makes it plausible that a sudden breach could occur under the right conditions. If the breach was abrupt, the inflow of salt water would have been violent enough to carve channels, reshape coastlines, and create shock waves across the basin. Such an event would leave both sedimentary evidence and a lasting impression on human memory. Marine archaeology in the Black Sea holds an advantage over many other underwater research sites. The deep waters are almost entirely anoxic, lacking in oxygen. This means that organic materials such as wood, textiles, and even food remains can be preserved for thousands of years. The potential for discovering intact settlements is higher here than in most other submerged landscapes. The main challenge is access. Much of the promising area lies in deep water, requiring advanced submersibles and costly expeditions. Even when sites are located, interpreting them is difficult. A structure might be the remnant of a fishing platform, a seasonal shelter, or a permanent dwelling. Distinctions that are crucial for understanding the scale of pre-flood societies but hard to draw from scattered remains. Historians still debate whether the Black Sea deluge, if it occurred suddenly, could have been witnessed by enough people to leave a mark on multiple cultural traditions. For the theory to hold, the basin would have needed to support a sizable population with extensive trade or migration links. Evidence of such a network before 5600 BCE remains elusive, though sites like Çatalhöyük in Anatolia suggest that complex communities existed nearby. If the hypothesis is correct, the Black Sea flood is one of the best candidates for a smoking gun event in the global flood myth tapestry. If it is not, the basin is still a treasure trove for understanding early human adaptation to changing environments. Either way, the waters conceal a record of human resilience in the face of overwhelming natural change. From the shores of the Black Sea, the narrative moves outward again, to maps that hint at an even older memory. Coastlines drawn before the end of the Ice Age, preserved in the most unexpected of places, the libraries of Renaissance Europe. These are the ancient maps of impossible shores. In 1513, a map was drawn in Constantinople by an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis. At first glance, it looks like other early Renaissance charts, the familiar outlines of Europe, Africa, and parts of the New World, all adorned with compass roses and marginal notes. But along its southern edge is something strange, a coastline resembling the northern fringe of Antarctica, drawn centuries before the continent's official discovery in 1820. Even stranger, this coastline appears without the vast ice sheet that now buries it, showing bays, inlets, and perhaps rivers. The Piri Reis map is not alone in its mystery. Several other early modern maps, including the Orontius Phineus map of 1531 and the Boachi map of 1737, depict southern lands with surprising detail. Advocates of the lost civilization hypothesis argue that these cartographers must have had access to older source maps, copies of copies reaching back to a time when global coastlines looked very different, perhaps before the end of the last ice age, when sea levels were lower and ice sheets smaller. The factual event here is straightforward. The Piri Reis map does exist, and its surviving fragment, about a third of the original, is preserved in the Topkapi Palace Museum in Istanbul. Piri Reis himself wrote in its annotations that he compiled it from 20 charts and mappae mundi, including maps from the time of Alexander the Great and Arab maps of India. This means his work was a synthesis, not an original survey. The puzzle is in the sources. What ancient maps was he referring to, and how accurate were they? Historians still debate whether the supposed Antarctic coastline is truly that, or merely a misinterpretation of South America's southern tip and nearby islands. Cartographic distortions were common in the early 1500s, especially when merging sources with different projections. Critics argue that the ice-free Antarctica interpretation is based on forced alignments and generous imagination. Yet the map's apparent accuracy in some other areas, such as the African and South American coasts, raises questions about how such precision was achieved so early. One strange but illustrative off-topic example comes from the Tabula Rogeriana, a 12th century Islamic map by al-Idrisi. Commissioned in Sicily, it was based on centuries of accumulated geographic knowledge from across the Islamic world, which in turn drew from Greek, Roman, Persian, and possibly even older sources. Al-Idrisi's work, while not perfect, contains surprising accuracies about distant regions, a reminder that maps are often palimpsests of many generations' observations. If such layering can preserve data for centuries, it is conceivable that, in theory, certain fragments of pre-Ice Age geography could survive in transmitted form. The hypothesis that fuels much of the fascination with the Piri Reis map is that some of its source material may have originated from a civilization capable of detailed coastal mapping long before recorded history, perhaps through advanced navigation techniques, astronomical measurements, or both. If such a civilization existed along Ice Age coastlines, their charts could have been copied by later cultures before their lands were submerged. Over centuries, the maps could have travelled through Phoenician traders, Alexandrian scholars, Byzantine archivists, and Islamic navigators before reaching Piri Reis. Mainstream cartography remains skeptical. The consensus is that any resemblance to ancient ice-free Antarctica is coincidental, a byproduct of map projection quirks and limited geographic knowledge of the southern hemisphere in the 16th century. But even skeptics acknowledge that the survival of geographical knowledge across thousands of years, albeit altered and fragmentary, is not impossible. From a technical perspective, accurate mapping requires a way to measure latitude and ideally longitude. Latitude can be determined using the sun's height or the pole star's position, techniques known to ancient mariners. Longitude is much more difficult without precise timekeeping, which was not achieved until the 18th century. This is one of the strongest arguments against the idea of advanced Ice Age cartography, unless such a civilization had methods we have yet to rediscover. The fascination with ancient maps extends beyond Antarctica. Some show islands that no longer exist, or coastlines different from today's. The Zeno map of 1558, for example, depicts Greenland free of ice, with fjords and bays visible. Whether this reflects older sources, artistic license, or a misunderstanding of explorers' reports remains unresolved. The Boache map, meanwhile, shows Antarctica divided into two large landmasses separated by a strait, a feature that modern seismic surveys suggest may correspond to subglacial topography. Historians still debate whether these details are remarkable coincidences or hints at forgotten surveys. Without the original source maps, proof remains elusive. What is clear is that the allure of these anomalies lies in their potential to connect our world to a deep, submerged past, to imagine that somewhere, perhaps in a library lost to fire or flood, once lay the complete charts of a world we no longer see. A curious real-world parallel can be seen in the survival of Herodotus' account of the Nile's course. Though imperfect, it preserved geographic information verified millennia later, showing how knowledge can endure through oral and textual transmission even in an imperfect state. If that endurance is possible over 2,000 years, perhaps, under rare conditions, it is possible over 12,000. The Piri Reis map remains for most scholars an intriguing but inconclusive artifact. For others, it is a breadcrumb in a trail leading back to an era before our own, when coastlines were wider, ice sheets smaller, and perhaps ships sailed from harbours that are now drowned. From the study of maps, the story moves back into the water, this time to a cluster of stones in the Bahamas that has stirred decades of speculation. Known as the Bimini Road, it has been hailed as either a natural formation or a fragment of one of the most enduring legends of all, the lost city of Atlantis. Beneath the turquoise waters of the Bahamas, about 6 meters below the surface off the island of North Bimini, lies a strange arrangement of massive limestone blocks, known popularly as the Bimini Road, and sometimes called the Bimini Wall. This submerged feature stretches for nearly a kilometre in a rough curving line. The blocks are rectangular or polygonal, fitted together in ways that, at first glance, appear deliberate. To some eyes, it resembles the remains of a paved causeway or harbour wall. The factual event is that the Bimini Road was first brought to public attention in 1968 when divers stumbled upon the formation. It quickly drew speculation, partly because of a peculiar coincidence. In the 1930s, American psychic Edgar Cayce had predicted that remnants of Atlantis would be found in the Bahamas around that very time. To those already inclined toward the Atlantis narrative, the discovery seemed like prophecy fulfilled. Mainstream geologists, however, have a different interpretation. They point to a natural process called beach rock formation. In tropical climates, sedimentary rock can form along shorelines when sand and shell fragments are cemented together by calcium carbonate. Over time, fractures develop in regular patterns, and as the shoreline erodes, large flat slabs can break off and settle in parallel rows. In this view, the Bimini Road is not a man-made artifact at all, but a natural geological formation. Historians still debate whether the road's regularity and arrangement are purely natural or might have been modified by human hands. Some divers have claimed to find evidence of tool marks, anchoring holes, or additional structures nearby, while skeptics counter that these could be products of erosion or biological activity. The challenge is that limestone in a marine environment is vulnerable to rapid change, making it difficult to distinguish ancient shaping from later natural wear. One strange and off-topic but illuminating comparison comes from Yonaguni in Japan's Ryukyu Islands, where massive underwater terraces have sparked similar debates. There, angular steps and platforms appear so regular that they look carved, yet most geologists see them as natural sandstone formations shaped by wave action. The lesson is clear. Nature can sometimes produce patterns our minds instinctively interpret as human-made. The hypothesis, favoured by Atlantis enthusiasts, is that the Bimini Road is the surviving edge of a once thriving coastal city that existed before the end of the last ice age, when sea levels were lower. In this scenario, the Bahamas would have been a chain of large islands, or even a continuous landmass, supporting settlements whose remains are now drowned. The road could have been part of a harbour complex, breakwater, or ceremonial platform. Advocates point to reports of additional underwater features in the area, though few have been studied extensively. From a geological standpoint, the Bahamas rest atop the Great Bahama Bank, a vast carbonate platform with a history of fluctuating sea levels. During glacial periods, much of this bank would have been dry land, making it plausible that humans occupied it. Archaeological evidence confirms that the islands were inhabited thousands of years ago, though the earliest known cultures here date to well after the sea level rise that ended the Ice Age. If earlier settlements existed, they would now be deeply submerged. The factual evidence for human presence in the immediate vicinity of the Bimini Road during the late Pleistocene is lacking. This absence, however, is partly due to the difficulty of underwater excavation in the area's shifting sands and currents. Without extensive surveys, it is impossible to rule out the possibility that human activity took place nearby. An interesting cultural layer to the Bimini Road mystery is the enduring power of the Atlantis myth. Plato's account, written in the 4th century BCE, describes a powerful maritime civilization that vanished beneath the sea in a single day and night of misfortune. While most historians treat the story as allegory or political metaphor, its geographic details, an island beyond the Pillars of Hercules, Gibraltar, larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined, have inspired centuries of speculation. The Bahamas lie in the western Atlantic, in a location that fits some interpretations of Plato's vague directions. Historians still debate whether the search for Atlantis is a productive line of inquiry or a distraction from more grounded archaeological work. Yet even skeptics acknowledge that the Atlantis legend, like many myths, may be a composite, a tapestry woven from multiple real events, including memories of lost islands, drowned coastlines, and destroyed cities. If so, the Bimini Road could be one of many coastal features that, regardless of origin, feed into this enduring narrative. One hypothesis that bridges the gap between strict geology and outright Atlantis romanticism is that the Bimini Road is indeed a natural formation, but one that ancient peoples may have adapted for their own purposes. Flat, stable limestone slabs could have served as convenient building surfaces, fish traps, or ceremonial gathering spots. Such a hybrid origin would explain the road's striking appearance without requiring a lost high civilization, while still allowing for a meaningful human story. From a technological standpoint, exploring the Bimini Road's true nature requires more than diver observations. High-resolution 3D mapping, microanalysis of the limestone surfaces, and deep sediment coring could help establish both the formation process and any signs of human modification. However, such research is costly and often yields ambiguous results, meaning the site's mystery is likely to persist for years to come. As sunlight filters through the shallow Bahamian waters, the Bimini Road continues to spark imaginations. Whether it is a natural sculpture of the sea or a relic of a forgotten shoreline culture, it occupies a liminal space between geology and myth, a place where science and legend meet in the shifting blue. From here, the journey moves inland once more, to a place far above sea level where another submerged story waits. High in the Andes lies Lake Titicaca, and beneath its surface there are ruins whose origins reach deep into the past. Lake Titicaca lies like a sapphire set in the crown of the Andes, straddling the border between Peru and Bolivia. At more than 3,800 meters above sea level, it is the highest navigable lake in the world. The air here is thin, the sunlight sharp, and the water deep, nearly 300 meters in some places. Yet even in this lofty setting, far removed from the sea, the story of a great flood whispers beneath the surface. The factual discovery that anchors this chapter began in the early 2000s, when an international team of archaeologists and divers explored parts of the lake's floor. Using sonar mapping and submersible cameras, they documented stone walls, terraces, and what appeared to be a temple complex, all lying beneath several meters of water. Some of these structures were located near the modern shoreline, but others were much farther out, suggesting they had been built on dry land before the lake expanded. Pottery fragments recovered from the site were dated to roughly 1,500 years ago, placing them within the Tiwanaku cultural sphere. Tiwanaku, whose monumental stone architecture still stands on the lake's southern shores, flourished between 500 and 1000 CE. It is often described as a highland civilization, adapted to the extreme conditions of the Altiplano. Yet the presence of underwater ruins raises questions about sudden environmental shifts in the region. Historians still debate whether the flooding of these sites was caused by gradual lake-level rise, tectonic activity, or a more abrupt event such as glacial meltwater surges during particularly warm decades. One strange but illuminating off-topic parallel comes from the shifting shores of the Caspian Sea, where ancient settlements have periodically been drowned and exposed as water levels changed. There, as in Titicaca, human habitation has always pressed close to the water's edge, drawn by its resources but vulnerable to its moods. The hypothesis that reaches beyond the documented Tiwanaku period is that Lake Titicaca may conceal much older layers of occupation, possibly dating back to the end of the last ice age, when the climate and hydrology of the Andes were markedly different. The lake is fed by glaciers and seasonal rains, and during wetter periods its boundaries would have expanded. If these expansions were sudden enough, they could have submerged settlements in a matter of years or decades. Local traditions around the lake are rich with flood narratives. The Aymara people tell of a time when the god Viracocha emerged from the waters to create the sun, moon, and stars, and to bring humanity into the world. In some versions, this creation follows a great inundation that destroyed earlier peoples. The Inca, who later absorbed these myths into their own cosmology, revered Titicaca as a sacred origin point. Whether these stories preserve a memory of actual flooding or are purely symbolic is impossible to say, but the geographic specificity, naming the lake itself, is striking. From a geological perspective, the Altiplano Basin has been shaped by both tectonic uplift and climatic oscillations. Studies of lake sediments show layers corresponding to dramatic shifts in water level over the last 25,000 years. Some of these changes align with the broader post-glacial climate swings that reshaped environments worldwide. During the late Pleistocene, Lake Titicaca may have been connected to other nearby basins, forming a much larger inland sea. One off-topic yet significant clue to how ancient highland peoples might have adapted to such changes comes from the agricultural terraces still visible on the surrounding slopes. These terraces, some still in use today, were engineered to conserve moisture, protect soil, and regulate temperature in the thin mountain air. A sudden rise in lake level could have destroyed low-lying terraces, forcing communities to rebuild higher up. In such a scenario, flooding would not only erase settlements, but also disrupt food production, compounding the disaster. Archaeologists investigating the underwater structures have found large, precisely cut stones resembling those used in Tiwanaku's ceremonial architecture, such as at the Kalasasaya and Pumapunku complexes. The craftsmanship suggests a continuation of building traditions, though whether the lake's submerged ruins belong to a major ceremonial site or smaller lakeshore communities is still unclear. Historians still debate whether these submerged features represent a single event of inundation or a more complex history of shifting shorelines. One possibility is that the Tiwanaku themselves witnessed only one phase of the lake's expansion, while earlier cultures experienced others, each flood leaving its own layer of ruin beneath the water. From the perspective of the lost civilization hypothesis, Lake Titicaca's greatest intrigue lies in its elevation. If advanced societies existed at the end of the 20th century, the Ice Age, they are usually imagined as coastal, where resources were abundant and maritime trade was possible. But in this view, highland sites like Titicaca could have been refuges, places where survivors of rising seas retreated to escape further flooding. If so, the lake's submerged ruins might be the inland counterpart to drowned cities on the continental shelves. Whether one subscribes to this idea or not, the lake's underwater archaeology demonstrates how human history is often written not only in stones above ground, but in those hidden beneath water. The combination of natural beauty, mythic significance, and scientific mystery makes Lake Titicaca a place where geology and legend are inseparable. From the high Andes, the narrative turns northward, toward a different kind of lost land, one that lay between Britain and mainland Europe, home to people who hunted, fished, and built in a world now buried under the cold, murky waters of the North Sea. This was Doggerland, a vanished realm that offers one of the clearest cases of a real, documented landscape erased by the rising seas. Where the grey waters of the North Sea now roll between the British Isles and mainland Europe, there was once a vast lowland plain. This land, now called Doggerland, stretched from the present-day east coast of England to the shores of Denmark and the Netherlands. It was not a barren place. Archaeological evidence and environmental reconstructions suggest it was a patchwork of rivers, marshes, forests, and open grasslands, a rich habitat for both humans and the animals they hunted. During the last ice age, sea levels were much lower, and Doggerland formed part of a continuous landmass connecting Britain to the European continent. As the glaciers retreated and oceans rose, this land was gradually reduced to islands, then finally submerged entirely. By around 6000 BCE, Doggerland had vanished beneath the waves. The factual event here is one of the best documented cases of post-glacial sea level rise, erasing a human landscape. Historians still debate how quickly the final inundation occurred. Some believe the submersion was a slow, centuries-long process, allowing communities to retreat inland in stages. Others suggest that sudden flooding events hastened the end, most dramatically the Storegga slide. Around 8,200 years ago, a massive undersea landslide off the coast of Norway triggered tsunamis up to 20 metres high, sweeping across the North Atlantic. In low-lying Doggerland, such waves would have devastated settlements and altered coastlines in a matter of hours. Evidence for Doggerland's existence comes not from ancient maps or myths, but from the seabed itself. Fishing trawlers and dredging operations have pulled up bones of mammoths, lions and humans, as well as stone tools and other artifacts. These finds show that people not only passed through the area, but lived and worked there for thousands of years. A strange yet revealing, off-topic example comes from the modern Zuiderzee works in the Netherlands, where entire polders, reclaimed land below sea level, were created in the 20th century. In reverse, Doggerland's story is one of unreclamation, fertile land lost back to the sea. Just as modern engineers can reshape coastlines, so too can nature, but on timescales and scales far beyond human control. The hypothesis that has intrigued some researchers is that Doggerland could have been a cultural hub in Mesolithic Europe, facilitating the exchange of ideas and technologies between populations on either side of the North Sea. Its rivers may have served as natural trade routes, and its open plains as shared hunting grounds. If so, the loss of Doggerland would have fragmented communities and isolated Britain, influencing the cultural divergence seen in later prehistory. From a geological standpoint, the North Sea basin is complex. Submerged river valleys, paleo-channels, snake across the seabed, mapping a lost drainage network. In some places, these valleys are filled with peat and plant remains, preserving pollen grains that allow scientists to reconstruct the ancient environment in detail. The picture that emerges is one of a lush, resource-rich land, dotted with lakes and wetlands teeming with fish and waterfowl. Historians still debate the degree to which Mesolithic peoples in Doggerland practice semi-permanent settlement versus seasonal migration. The variety of tools recovered, from fishing gear to woodworking implements, suggests a versatile lifestyle well adapted to both land and water. As the sea encroached, these skills may have eased the transition to new coastal environments, though not without hardship. One off-topic but telling modern analogy to the loss of Doggerland is the gradual disappearance of island nations like Kiribati under current sea level rise. There, as in prehistory, the displacement of communities is not only a logistical challenge, but also a cultural one, severing ties to ancestral landscapes. In terms of the lost civilization hypothesis, Doggerland offers a sobering reminder. Here is a large, well-populated land that truly did vanish beneath rising seas within human memory, yet much of its story is irretrievably gone. No monumental architecture survives, no written records exist, only scattered artifacts and geological traces. If this can happen to a Mesolithic landscape known to archaeology, then the possibility of losing more advanced coastal cultures in deeper antiquity cannot be dismissed outright. Advances in marine surveying are beginning to fill in the map. High-resolution sonar has revealed ancient river channels, estuaries, and even what appear to be the outlines of small islands that once dotted the floodplain. Future exploration may uncover preserved sites on the seabed, camps, hearths, or even wooden structures protected under layers of sediment. For now, Doggerland stands as one of the clearest bridges between myth and reality, a real Atlantis of the North, remembered not in oral tradition but rediscovered through science. Its story flows naturally into another dramatic landscape reshaped by flood, a place far from Europe, carved by forces so immense they transformed hundreds of kilometers of land in a geological instant. This is the tale of the channeled scablands. In the dry heart of eastern Washington, state lies a landscape so strange that early geologists struggled to believe their own eyes. The channeled scablands sprawl across thousands of square kilometers, etched with deep coulees, dry cataracts, and vast rippled plains of gravel. Towering cliffs of basalt rise abruptly from flat ground. Entire river channels lie abandoned, as though the water that carved them vanished overnight. To the first scientists who surveyed this terrain in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it seemed impossible that such features could have formed in the relatively short span of human history. The factual turning point came in the 1920s, when a geologist named J. Harlan Bretz proposed a radical explanation. The scablands were created not by slow erosion, but by massive sudden floods on a scale beyond anything seen in modern times. According to Bretz's theory, the source was an ice-dammed lake in what is now Montana, known as Glacial Lake Missoula. When the ice dam gave way, it released up to 2,500 cubic kilometers of water in a single outburst. This torrent surged westward at speeds approaching 80 kilometers per hour, scouring the land, ripping away soil and carving channels hundreds of meters wide. The floodwaters rushed through what is now the Columbia River Basin before pouring into the Pacific Ocean. And it didn't happen just once. Evidence suggests that this cycle of ice dam collapse and catastrophic flooding repeated dozens of times during the last ice age. Historians still debate the exact number and timing of these floods, but the geological evidence is overwhelming. Giant current ripples, some as high as a house, line the landscape. Dry waterfalls like Dry Falls in Grant County, now silent cliffs nearly 120 meters tall, testify to the former presence of water flows many times greater than the Amazon River. One strange, off-topic parallel to the channeled scablands formation can be found in the Icelandic Jökullaups, sudden glacial outburst floods that occur when volcanic heat melts ice, releasing torrents that reshape valleys in hours. These smaller modern events help scientists visualize the mechanics of ancient megafloods on a more comprehensible scale. The hypothesis that reaches beyond geology is that similar outburst floods could have occurred elsewhere at the end of the Ice Age, impacting human populations on an immense scale. In North America, for instance, the Missoula floods would have swept through landscapes occupied by Paleo-Indian peoples. While direct archaeological evidence of human loss from these events is sparse, much would have been obliterated. The floods could have displaced entire communities, altering migration patterns and resource availability. From a broader perspective, the channeled scablands also demonstrate how rapidly a familiar environment can be erased. In just a matter of days, fertile valleys could be stripped to bare rock, settlements washed away, and topography transformed beyond recognition. For any culture that experienced such an event, the memory would be seared into oral tradition, perhaps later merging with other flood narratives to form regional myths. Historians still debate whether the Missoula floods were unique in their magnitude or whether similar processes occurred in Siberia, northern Europe, or elsewhere in the Americas. In Siberia's Altai Mountains, for example, researchers have identified giant current ripples and flood deposits reminiscent of those in Washington, suggesting that glacial lakes there also failed catastrophically. The factual significance of the scablands lies in the way they overturned the long-dominant geological doctrine of uniformitarianism, which held that Earth's features were shaped primarily by slow, gradual processes. Bretz's catastrophic flood theory was initially met with skepticism, even ridicule, because it evoked the kind of dramatic events often associated with myth. Over time, however, accumulating evidence forced the scientific community to accept that, at least in some cases, the land could indeed be reshaped almost overnight. One off-topic yet relevant detail is how Bretz's perseverance in defending his controversial ideas became a case study in scientific persistence. For decades, he stood largely alone, armed only with field observations and logical deduction. It wasn't until the 1970s, when satellite imagery and further sediment analysis confirmed his theories, that he received full recognition, and even then, he was in his 90s. The channeled scablands serve as a geological reminder that catastrophic flooding is not confined to mythic prehistory. It is a natural process, capable of producing apocalyptic transformations within the span of human observation. For those exploring the possibility of lost civilizations, they offer a plausible mechanism by which entire cultural landscapes could vanish without a trace, leaving behind nothing but altered rock and scattered debris. From these dry, windswept channels of the American West, our journey turns to another body of water shaped by both human history and geological change. Far from the glacial floods of North America, the Red Sea once offered a corridor of trade, migration, and possibly ancient engineering, until shifting waters transformed its coasts and drowned pathways that may have connected worlds. Between Africa and the Arabian Peninsula stretches a narrow ribbon of water, the Red Sea, shimmering in heat and bordered by some of the most arid lands on Earth. Today it is a marine highway, carrying ships between the Suez Canal and the Indian Ocean. But in prehistory, this body of water may have been both a barrier and a bridge, its shifting shorelines shaping human migration, trade, and perhaps even early attempts at maritime engineering. Beneath its surface, archaeologists have identified traces of drowned landscapes, silent witnesses to an era when coastlines lay far from where they do now. During the last ice age, global sea levels were more than 100 meters lower than today. The Red Sea's shape and depth meant that its coastline was significantly narrower, with wide stretches of flat land along its edges. In certain periods, shallow channels may have linked natural harbours and coastal plains now submerged. These were prime areas for human settlement, rich in fish, shellfish, and salt, with access to both African and Arabian hinterlands. The factual foundation for this part of the story comes from paleo shoreline mapping and underwater surveys. Off the coasts of modern-day Eritrea, Yemen, and Saudi Arabia, sonar imaging has revealed submerged terraces and river channels that once flowed into the sea. Along these drowned valleys lie concentrations of shell middens, stone tools, and possible structural remains, some dating back more than 8,000 years. Historians still debate whether these submerged features represent simple fishing camps or nodes in a larger network of coastal communities. The archaeological record on land suggests that the Red Sea region has been a major corridor for human movement since at least 60,000 years ago, possibly even earlier. This is the so-called Southern Dispersal Route theory, which proposes that some of the earliest modern humans leaving Africa crossed the Bab el-Mandeb Strait at the southern end of the Red Sea when sea levels were low enough to make the crossing feasible by raft or even on foot across exposed land bridges. One strange yet relevant off-topic case involves the ancient harbours of the Egyptian Red Sea coast, built during the Middle Kingdom and New Kingdom to launch expeditions to the fabled land of Punt. Sites like Persian Gulf Oasis have yielded remains of ship timbers, anchors, and storage jars, evidence that even in the Bronze Age mariners were venturing deep into the Red Sea for trade. While far younger than the Ice Age landscapes in question, these harbours demonstrate the enduring strategic value of the sea's coastal nodes. The hypothesis that intrigues proponents of lost civilization theories is that before the final post-glacial sea level rise, the Red Sea basin may have hosted a chain of settlements, ports, or even proto-urban centres facilitating early maritime trade between Africa, Arabia, and beyond. When the waters rose, these sites would have been drowned, forcing survivors to relocate inland or adapt to new shorelines. If such a network existed, it could have been a precursor to the later flourishing of civilizations in both regions. Geologically, the Red Sea sits atop a rift valley, a zone where the African and Arabian tectonic plates are pulling apart. This means its floor is dotted with deep basins, volcanic ridges, and geothermal vents. Over millennia, tectonic uplift and subsidence could have altered local sea levels and submerged coastal features even without global glacial melt. Historians still debate whether oral traditions from coastal communities in Eritrea, Sudan, and Yemen preserve any memory of ancient shoreline shifts. In some cases, place names and folk stories reference the old shore or the drowned wells, hinting at local knowledge of environmental change. While these references may stem from more recent medieval or even modern events, they illustrate how human memory clings to vanished landscapes. An off-topic yet telling modern analogy comes from the Farasin Islands in the southern Red Sea. Archaeological surveys there have uncovered vast shell middens and stone fish traps dating back over 7,000 years, preserved by the arid climate and relative isolation. These finds prove that early communities were capable of complex coastal resource management, and that similar sites now submerged could be waiting in deeper waters. If the Red Sea's drowned features are ever fully mapped and excavated, they could shed light on one of the great questions of human prehistory. How early did maritime cultures emerge, and how far could they connect? For now, the submerged terraces and paleo channels remain tantalizing fragments of a puzzle, enough to suggest lost human presence, but not yet enough to reveal its scale. From this narrow corridor between continents, the story moves to a vast sunken land far to the east, an entire subcontinent that vanished beneath the rising seas of the early Holocene. Known as Sundaland, this drowned world may have been one of the largest and richest environments ever lost to post-Ice Age flooding, and some believe it could be the cradle of ancient legends across Southeast Asia. Stretching across what is now Indonesia, Malaysia, and surrounding seas, lies the ghost of a drowned subcontinent. During the last Ice Age, when sea levels were far lower, this landmass, known today as Sundaland, was a continuous expanse of forests, rivers, and fertile plains connecting much of Southeast Asia. Sumatra, Java, and Borneo were not islands, but highlands in a vast lowland that extended thousands of kilometres from the Asian mainland to the edge of the deep Pacific basins. When the ice melted and the seas rose, Sundaland all but disappeared, leaving only scattered islands and a memory hidden in myths and sediments. The factual outline is supported by bathymetric mapping and paleo-environmental studies. Between about 20,000 and 7,000 years ago, global sea levels rose more than 120 metres, steadily drowning Sundaland's coastal plains and river valleys. Marine geologists have traced ancient river systems, the so-called Paleo-Sunda rivers, now lying deep beneath the Java Sea. These networks would have supported abundant freshwater fish, fertile floodplains for agriculture, and interconnected travel routes for early humans. Historians still debate whether Sundaland was simply a rich hunting and gathering territory or the home of more complex societies. Archaeological finds on surviving islands show evidence of human occupation stretching back tens of thousands of years, including sophisticated stone tools and early art. The problem is that much of the most promising terrain now lies underwater, buried beneath layers of sediment and coral growth. One strange but relevant off-topic comparison comes from the Doggerland region in the North Sea, where detailed mapping has reconstructed an entire drowned landscape, complete with hills, rivers, and marshes. In theory, similar reconstructions could be done for Sundaland, but on a scale many times larger. The sheer size of the submerged area, roughly the equivalent of modern-day India, makes it one of the largest lost land masses of the Holocene. The Sundaland hypothesis, advanced by some scholars and popularised in part by Stephen Oppenheimer's book Eden in the East, proposes that the region may have been a centre of early human innovation. In this view, rising seas forced large-scale migrations into mainland Asia and across the Pacific, potentially spreading languages, agricultural techniques, and myths, including flood stories, far beyond Southeast Asia. Proponents link this to the Austronesian expansion, one of the most significant prehistoric migrations, though mainstream linguists and archaeologists tend to see that expansion as much later, beginning around 3000 BCE. From a geological perspective, Sundaland's submergence was not uniform. Certain areas would have flooded slowly, giving inhabitants time to retreat inland. Others, especially narrow straits and low-lying basins, may have seen rapid inundations, turning hills into islands almost overnight. Coral reef studies and sediment cores have revealed abrupt changes in salinity and ecosystem structure, marking these transitions. Historians still debate whether specific Southeast Asian myths preserve memories of Sundaland's drowning. In some Indonesian and Malaysian traditions, there are tales of a vast land to the south or east that was swallowed by the sea. In the Philippines, myths of great floods sometimes include details about lost plains and mountains now beneath the waves. Whether these are echoes of real events or independent symbolic stories remains unresolved, but their geographic focus is intriguing. A particularly compelling off-topic modern parallel is the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. In parts of Aceh, entire coastal communities were erased in a matter of minutes, leaving only ruins and altered shorelines. Survivors reported that the land they had always known simply went away. If such events occurred, repeatedly in the millennia-long flooding of Sundaland, it is easy to imagine how they could become embedded in oral history as divine or cosmic punishment. The scale of Sundaland's loss invites speculation about cultural connections across the Pacific and Indian Oceans. If complex maritime communities existed there, their dispersal could help explain certain early similarities in megalithic architecture, navigation techniques, and agricultural practices in distant regions. This hypothesis is far from proven, but the idea that a major Holocene migration began here fits with genetic evidence showing deep links between Southeast Asian, Polynesian, and even some South American populations. Marine archaeology in the region is still in its infancy. The combination of deep waters, strong currents, and extensive coral cover makes surveying difficult. Yet scattered finds, stone tools from submerged caves, wooden structures preserved in anoxic mud, hint at a richer story waiting to be uncovered. The potential rewards are immense, the chance to reconstruct not just an environment, but a whole network of early human societies. From the wide, warm waters of Sundaland, the path of inquiry leads northwest to a smaller but equally intriguing drowned world. In the heart of the Middle East lies the Persian Gulf, now a shallow sea. But in the late Ice Age, it may have been a lush oasis, a fertile basin that could have nurtured human communities for millennia before the waters rose and claimed it. Today, the Persian Gulf is a shallow arm of the Arabian Sea, bordered by some of the most arid landscapes in the world. deserts stretching across the Arabian Peninsula and the Iranian Plateau. Yet during the late Ice Age and into the early Holocene, this region may have been something entirely different, a fertile inland basin, watered by great rivers and sustaining human communities for thousands of years. This idea, known as the Persian Gulf Oasis hypothesis, transforms our image of the Gulf from a maritime channel into a vanished heartland of early civilization. At the height of the last Ice Age, global sea levels were more than 100 meters lower than today. The floor of the present-day Persian Gulf, an area roughly 1,000 kilometers long and up to 200 kilometers wide, would have been dry land. The Shatt al-Arab river system, formed by the merging of the Tigris and Euphrates, would have flowed across this basin to meet the Gulf of Oman. Joining it were the Karun River from the Iranian plateau, and ancient channels flowing down from the Zagros Mountains. Together, they would have formed a lush network of waterways feeding an expansive inland plain. The factual evidence for this reconstruction comes from marine geology, sediment cores, and paleo-environmental studies. Cores taken from the Gulf floor contain layers of riverine sediment beneath marine deposits, indicating that for much of the late Pleistocene, the area was indeed a terrestrial. Environment pollen analysis from these sediments suggests the presence of grasslands, woodlands, and freshwater wetlands, a sharp contrast to the arid coasts of today. Historians still debate whether this oasis served merely as a migration corridor or as a long-term centre of settlement. The hypothesis, advanced most prominently by archaeologist Geoffrey Rose, suggests that as the climate fluctuated during the Ice Age, human populations may have retreated into the Gulf Basin when surrounding deserts became too dry. Here they would have had access to fresh water, fertile soils, and abundant game. When sea levels rose rapidly at the end of the Ice Age, these populations would have been forced to disperse, perhaps contributing to the sudden appearance of advanced farming communities along the Tigris-Euphrates floodplain around 8,000 years ago. One strange but telling off-topic example of how geography can erase and reveal human history is the Aral Sea in Central Asia. Within a few decades in the 20th century, vast stretches of its floor were exposed by water diversion, revealing old settlements, ships stranded in desert, and ancient shorelines. In the case of the Persian Gulf, the process was reversed. A fertile basin drowned in a geologically short span of time, its remains hidden under shallow salty waters. The lost civilization interpretation of the Persian Gulf Oasis hypothesis takes the idea further, proposing that the basin may have been home to proto-urban settlements, perhaps even an early cradle of agriculture and trade. In this scenario, the flooding of the Gulf could explain certain sudden developments in Mesopotamia, as displaced populations brought established traditions of farming, architecture, and governance to the river valleys. From a geological perspective, the flooding of the Gulf would have been relatively swift. Meltwater pulses from collapsing ice sheets, particularly around 8,000 years ago, may have caused sea levels to rise several meters in just a few centuries. Low-lying areas would have been inundated first, followed by the gradual encroachment of the shoreline toward higher ground. This creeping flood would have forced communities to relocate repeatedly, eventually abandoning the basin entirely. Historians still debate whether Mesopotamian flood myths, including the Sumerian tale of Ziusudra and the biblical story of Noah, could be distant cultural echoes of the Gulf's inundation. While these stories are usually linked to river flooding, the scale of the Gulf's drowning offers a plausible backdrop for a regional memory of the waters rising and taking the land. One off-topic yet highly relevant archaeological precedent for this kind of discovery is the site of Dilmun, a Bronze Age trading hub mentioned in Mesopotamian texts. Once thought mythical, Dilmun was eventually identified with locations in modern Bahrain and the Gulf Coast. Its rediscovery shows how legends of places in the waters can sometimes be rooted in real geography. If the Persian Gulf Oasis was indeed a centre of human settlement, it could help explain some of the earliest evidence for seafaring in the region. Archaeologists have found remains of reed boats and maritime trade artifacts dating back more than 7,000 years along the Gulf coasts, hinting that a tradition of boat building may have begun well before the basin flooded. Today, the shallow depth of much of the Gulf, averaging just 50 metres, makes it an ideal candidate for underwater archaeology. Yet political boundaries, oil infrastructure, and murky waters have limited large-scale exploration. As a result, the basin remains largely unmapped in archaeological terms, its potential treasures hidden beneath sediment and coral. From the drowned plains of the Gulf, our path leads away from submerged landscapes into a realm where history meets memory. Not all evidence of ancient floods is buried in the sea. Some is carried in the minds and voices of living people. Across the world, indigenous oral traditions preserve stories of waters rising, lands disappearing, and worlds remade. These echoes in oral tradition form the next chapter in the search for humanity's forgotten past. Long before history was written in clay, ink, or stone, it was carried in the human voice. Around fires, on long journeys, during rites of passage, stories were told and retold. Stories that were more than entertainment. They were memory, identity, and warning. In many cultures, these oral traditions speak of a time when the land itself changed, when seas rose or waters poured in from the horizon, and when people had to move or perish. These are the echoes in oral tradition that may preserve traces of events far older than any surviving text. In Australia, some Aboriginal groups tell of landscapes now under the sea. These aren't vague legends, but specific place-based accounts. Elders in the Yidinji language group, for example, have described the coastline near Cairns as it was when the Great Barrier Reef was dry land, recounting islands that are now submerged. Researchers comparing these stories with paleo-sea level data have found matches that suggest the narratives could be up to 7,000 years old. That would make them among the longest continuous oral histories on Earth. The factual event that connects these stories to science is the well-documented post-Ice Age sea level rise. Between 20,000 and 7,000 years ago, the world's oceans rose over 120 metres, redrawing every coastline on the planet. This was not a uniform process. In some regions, the sea crept in slowly, while in others it surged abruptly due to events like glacial lake outbursts or tectonic shifts. The people who lived through these changes would have witnessed their world shrinking, one year's fishing ground or hunting plain becoming the next year's shallow bay. Historians still debate whether oral traditions can preserve such ancient memories intact. Skeptics point out that stories often shift over time, absorbing symbolic elements and blending events. Yet studies of indigenous narratives in Australia, North America, and the Pacific Islands have shown that certain geographic details, like the location of a former river mouth or the shape of a now submerged hill, can remain consistent for millennia when embedded in ritual and tied to sacred geography. One strange but revealing off-topic example comes from the Pacific Northwest of North America. Among the Hu-Ayat people of Vancouver Island, there is a story of a great wave that destroyed villages. In the 1990s, geologists identified sand deposits consistent with a tsunami caused by the Cascadia subduction zone earthquake of January 1700. Japanese records of an orphan tsunami on the same date match this event. Here, oral history and scientific evidence aligned perfectly, showing that some stories can indeed preserve accurate accounts of natural disasters for centuries or more. The hypothesis that ties these oral traditions to the search for lost civilizations is that some myths may encode memories not just of environmental change, but of specific cultural losses. A flood story could be more than a warning about nature. It could be a eulogy for a city, a ceremonial site, or a fertile homeland swallowed by the sea. Over generations, the details might shift, gods and spirits taking the place of natural forces, moral lessons overlaying historical events, but the core memory would remain. In Polynesia, for instance, Several islands have stories about ancestral lands lying to the west or southwest, beyond the horizon, that sank beneath the waves. While some interpret these as symbolic lands of the dead, others suggest they could recall real island chains lost to sea level rise or volcanic collapse. Similarly, in the Andaman Islands of the Indian Ocean, oral traditions speak of a time when the coastline lay far beyond its present reach, with forests and hunting grounds now underwater. Historians still debate how to separate fact from allegory in these narratives. Linguists sometimes trace words for sea and land in related languages, looking for shifts that might correspond to geographic changes. Anthropologists record and compare variants of a story across different communities to identify stable elements, and geologists map those elements against known environmental changes. In some cases, the fit is surprisingly close. An off-topic but telling analogy comes from astronomy. Before telescopes, many indigenous peoples recorded eclipses, comets, and meteor showers in oral form. In some cases, these accounts have been matched to known astronomical events centuries earlier. If such precision can be maintained in the sky, it is plausible that major terrestrial changes, especially those tied to survival, could be remembered for equal or greater spans of time. One implication of this line of thinking is that oral traditions might point us toward locations worth exploring archaeologically. If a community's stories consistently describe a drowned river valley, or an island that is no more, that place might hold submerged remains. Using these traditions as guides, researchers could prioritize certain areas for sonar surveys or sediment coring. The challenge is that many of the most ancient oral histories are endangered, with language loss and cultural disruption threatening their continuity. In some cases, the last fluent storytellers are passing away, and with them potentially unique records of prehistoric events. This urgency has led to collaborative projects between scientists and indigenous knowledge keepers, aiming to preserve and study these narratives in a respectful way. From the perspective of the lost civilization hypothesis, oral tradition stands as a living link to deep time. It is a bridge between the submerged world and the present day, carrying whispers of places and peoples erased from the land but not from memory. From these living voices, the story turns upward, to the skies and beyond, for one of the more controversial ideas in the study of ancient catastrophes, that some of the great floods in human memory may have been set in motion by events not of this earth. In the next part, we examine the role of comet impacts and other cosmic intrusions in the story of the Great Flood. High in the atmosphere, far beyond the reach of human sight, a fragment of cosmic debris hurtles toward Earth. It is small on the scale of planets, perhaps no more than a kilometre across, yet it carries more energy than all the world's nuclear weapons combined. When it arrives, the effects will not be confined to the point of impact. They will ripple through the atmosphere, the oceans, and the very climate of the planet. Such events have happened before, and some researchers believe they may have played a role in the great floods remembered in human myth. The factual starting point for this idea lies in the well-documented impact events of Earth's past. The asteroid that struck the Yucatan Peninsula 66 million years ago is the most famous, credited with ending the reign of the dinosaurs, but smaller, more recent impacts have also left their mark. The Tunguska event of 1908 flattened 2,000 square kilometres of Siberian forest, though it left no crater. Even this modest-sized explosion, likely caused by an incoming object 50 to 60 metres wide, demonstrated the destructive potential of spaceborne projectiles. Historians still debate whether any known flood events in human prehistory can be tied directly to cosmic impacts. The most discussed candidate is the so-called Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. This theory proposes that around 12,900 years ago, fragments of a disintegrating comet struck Earth or exploded in the atmosphere over North America and possibly other regions. Proponents argue that the resulting fires, atmospheric dust and shock waves triggered abrupt climate cooling, disrupted ecosystems, and melted large portions of the Laurentide ice sheet. This sudden melting, they suggest, could have unleashed catastrophic floods, contributing to mass extinctions and perhaps to cultural upheaval among Paleo-Indian peoples. Evidence cited for this hypothesis includes a thin, dark layer found in geological and archaeological sites across several continents. This layer contains unusual materials, microscopic carbon spherules, high-temperature minerals, magnetic grains rich in iridium, and even nanodiamonds, all of which some researchers interpret as products of intense heat from extraterrestrial impacts. Critics counter that such materials can also form in terrestrial processes, such as wildfires or volcanic eruptions, and that the dating of the layers is not always consistent. One strange but illuminating off-topic example of a sudden cosmic event's effects comes from the Chelyabinsk meteor in 2013. This 20-meter-wide object exploded in the atmosphere over Russia, releasing a shockwave that shattered windows and injured over 1,000 people. The blast reminded scientists that even relatively small space rocks can cause widespread damage, and that far larger ones have struck in the past. The hypothesis linking cosmic impacts to ancient floods hinges on the idea of rapid ice melt. If a large enough fragment exploded over or struck an ice sheet, the resulting heat could melt billions of tons of ice in hours or days. This water, released into preglacial lakes or directly into the ocean, could produce massive outburst floods, events comparable to, or even exceeding, the Missoula floods that shaped the channeled scablands. In coastal regions, the combination of sudden sea level spikes and impact-generated tsunamis could devastate settlements. Historians still debate whether the impact hypothesis explains the Younger Dryas climate shift better than existing models based on meltwater pulses alone. Many accept that sudden flooding occurred in this period, but question whether a cosmic trigger is necessary to account for it. The mainstream view remains cautious. Impacts are rare on human timescales, and extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. From a cultural perspective, it is tempting to connect ancient flood myths to dramatic celestial events. Stories from diverse regions, including some Native American and Aboriginal Australian traditions, speak of fire from the sky, or a star that fell, preceding or accompanying great floods. While such motifs could be symbolic, they might also encode memories of real meteor events witnessed in prehistory. One off-topic parallel is the documented memory of volcanic eruptions in oral tradition. For example, the eruption of Mount Mazama, which formed Crater Lake in Oregon, about 7,700 years ago, is remembered in Klamath tribal stories describing a battle between sky and underworld spirits that ended with a mountain collapsing into itself. The level of detail preserved over millennia suggests that extraordinary natural events can leave a long and vivid imprint on human storytelling. If comet or asteroid impacts did play a role in triggering ancient floods, they would add another layer of complexity to the story of lost civilizations. Not only would such societies have faced rising seas from gradual post-glacial warming, but they might also have been dealt sudden, devastating blows from the heavens. Survivors might interpret these as acts of gods, weaving them into myth in ways that merge celestial and terrestrial catastrophe. From the realm of cosmic fire, the narrative now turns to what follows catastrophe. Whether caused by rising seas, collapsing ice sheets, or falling stars, floods inevitably leave survivors. The next chapter examines the archaeological signs of how early peoples rebuilt their worlds after the deluge, and what those signs might reveal about what was lost. When the waters recede, what remains is not simply the land, but the altered memory of a people. Floods, whether gradual or sudden, strip away the familiar, erasing boundaries, submerging fields, sweeping away buildings, and fracturing communities. Yet across the world's archaeological record, we find patterns of survival and reinvention. In the early Holocene, following the final great floods of the Ice Age, human societies adapted in ways that hint at both resilience and a lingering memory of what had been lost. The factual outline of this recovery is visible in the transition from scattered mobile bands to more permanent settlements. In places such as the Near East, Early Neolithic villages appear in the archaeological record not long after regional flood events. Jericho, one of the oldest known continuously inhabited sites, shows signs of settlement as early as 10,000 BCE, with evidence of early farming, irrigation, and fortification. Whether Jericho's origins are directly tied to post-flood migration is uncertain, but the timing corresponds with a broader global pattern of communities clustering in areas less vulnerable to inundation. Historians still debate whether the shift toward agriculture and permanent dwellings was a direct consequence of environmental displacement or part of a longer independent trajectory. One school of thought suggests that survivors of drowned coastal plains, such as those in the Persian Gulf or along the Sunda Shelf, brought with them knowledge of cultivation and animal husbandry, hastening the development of agriculture in inland refuges. Another argues that agriculture arose independently in multiple places as a response to climatic stability after the Ice Age. One strange but illuminating off-topic example of post-catastrophe adaptation comes from the eruption of Mount Tambora in 1815. The massive volcanic blast caused the year without a summer in 1816, devastating crops worldwide. Communities that survived often reorganized their economies and trade patterns, developed new crops, and altered settlement patterns to cope with the changed climate. The archaeological record of the early Holocene may capture similar processes, people rethinking how and where they lived after the year without dry land in their own time. In regions such as Anatolia, the Levant, and the Indus River Basin, early Holocene settlements show architectural and technological advancements that seem to appear fully formed. Planned layouts, communal storage facilities, and elaborate ritual spaces. The hypothesis advanced by some researchers is that these features reflect inherited knowledge from older, now submerged communities. The sudden appearance of a large-scale organization, in this view, is not an evolutionary leap from primitive beginnings, but a transplant from a prior stage of development. Historians still debate whether such sudden complexity is real or an artifact of the patchy archaeological record. After all, the absence of earlier structures on land may simply mean they were built of perishable materials, or that the relevant sites now lie underwater. Yet the possibility of cultural carryover remains plausible, especially in coastal and riverine environments where navigation, trade, and large-scale cooperation were advantageous. One of the most compelling examples of post-flood innovation is Çatalhöyük in southern Anatolia, dating to around 7,500 BCE. Here, hundreds of mud brick houses were built in a dense honeycomb-like arrangement, with no streets. People entered their homes through rooftop openings. Murals, sculptures, and shrines suggest a rich symbolic life, alongside practical urban planning. While there is no direct evidence linking Çatalhöyük's founders to a flooded homeland, its scale and sophistication have led some to speculate about deeper cultural roots. An off-topic but relevant archaeological analogy is the rise of the Lapita culture in the Pacific around 1500 BCE. The Lapita spread rapidly across thousands of kilometers of ocean, establishing settlements with similar pottery styles and social structures. Some scholars believe this rapid expansion reflects the migration of a culturally unified people, rather than independent development at each island. By analogy, early Holocene inland settlements with shared traits could represent displaced coastal populations spreading into new territories. The hypothesis that links this to lost civilizations proposes that inland sites from the early Holocene are the visible remnants of a much larger, partially drowned cultural network. Floods forced the survivors into smaller, more defensible and less resource-rich areas, slowing their technological momentum. Over time, the grandeur of the coastal cities was forgotten, surviving only in myths of golden ages before the waters came. Historians still debate how much technological regression occurs after such disasters. Ethnographic studies of modern displaced communities show that while survival skills often remain, specialized knowledge can be lost quickly if it is no longer directly useful. The skill to build large stone harbors, for example, would fade within a few generations if the sea was no longer central to a community's life. From a geological perspective, post-flood landscapes also pose challenges. Shorelines were unstable, river systems altered, and formerly fertile land could be salinated or buried under silt. In some cases, the best remaining agricultural land was already occupied by other groups, leading to cultural blending or conflict. Archaeological layers from this period often show abrupt changes in tool types, pottery styles, and burial practices, suggesting the merging of displaced populations with established inland communities. One off-topic yet poignant modern example of this blending comes from the resettlement of coastal fishing communities after the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. In places where survivors moved inland, their maritime traditions adapted or disappeared, replaced by the agricultural or pastoral practices of their new neighbours. Over time, the old ways became stories, much as flood legends may be the last echoes of Ice Age coastal life. From the vantage point of archaeology, the centuries after the Great Floods are as important as the floods themselves. They tell us how humans respond to loss, whether by rebuilding in place, moving to higher ground, or forging entirely new identities. And in these acts of survival, we may glimpse faint outlines of what was lost. From here, the story turns to the counterpoint in any historical mystery, the skeptic's view. For every hypothesis about vanished civilizations and flood-triggered cultural shifts, there are scholars who argue that the evidence fits perfectly within the known framework of human prehistory. In the next part, we examine the skeptic's lens, weighing their arguments against the allure of the unknown. Every compelling mystery attracts its counterweight, skepticism. In the case of great floods and the possibility of erased civilizations, skeptics insist that the extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and that so far the evidence remains unconvincing. While no one disputes that massive floods and sea level rise occurred at the end of the Ice Age, mainstream archaeologists and historians argue that these events fit neatly within the established story of human prehistory without invoking advanced lost societies. The factual starting point for the skeptic's case is the archaeological timeline. The oldest unequivocal evidence of large-scale complex societies, cities, writing, monumental architecture, appears in the Near East around 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, with Sumer, followed by Egypt, the Indus Valley, and early Chinese civilizations. Before this, the record shows smaller-scale farming villages, seasonal, camps, and mobile hunter-gatherer groups. To skeptics, the absence of clear, datable, complex urban remains from earlier periods means there is no need to imagine advanced Ice Age civilizations erased by floods. Historians still debate whether the absence of evidence is a true void or simply a gap in our access to submerged landscapes. Skeptics point out that archaeology has uncovered many coastal and riverine sites from prehistory that are well preserved, such as Mesolithic settlements in Denmark's fjords or Neolithic villages in the Black Sea, yet none display the technological hallmarks of a lost high civilization. They argue that if such societies had existed in significant numbers, more traces should have survived inland beyond the reach of the sea. One strange but relevant off-topic case is the Piltdown Man hoax of the early 20th century. For decades, this fraudulent fossil supported a false narrative of human evolution in Britain, until better evidence overturned it. Skeptics use such examples to stress the importance of rigorous dating, peer review, and avoiding confirmation bias when interpreting ambiguous finds. The hypothesis favoured by skeptics is that flood myths are the product of local disasters magnified by storytelling, sometimes merged with memories of gradual sea level rise. They emphasise that floods are among the most common and destructive natural hazards, so it is unsurprising that many cultures independently developed flood legends without a shared origin in a single global catastrophe. From this perspective, the similarities between myths reflect common human experiences, not evidence of a vanished global culture. Geologists in the skeptical camp also caution against overstating the suddenness of post-glacial flooding. While events like the Storegga Slide tsunami or the breaching of the Bosporus may have been abrupt, most sea level rise occurred over centuries or millennia, allowing gradual adaptation rather than apocalyptic collapse. This pace, they argue, would have made it less likely for entire civilizations to vanish without leaving inland evidence. Historians still debate whether certain anomalous artifacts, such as the Piri Reis map, the Yonaguni monument, or underwater structures in the Gulf of Kambat, are genuine indicators of ancient complexity, or simply misunderstood natural formations and later intrusions. Skeptics tend to favour the latter, often pointing out that the human mind is wired to find patterns even where none exist, a tendency called pareidolia. An off-topic analogy to this cognitive bias comes from astronomy, where early telescopic observers believed they saw artificial canals on Mars. We now know these were optical illusions and wishful interpretations of natural features. Skeptics suggest that some claims of underwater cities may be a similar misreading of natural geology. The skeptical lens does not dismiss the importance of studying past floods. On the contrary, it acknowledges that these events shaped human migration, settlement patterns, and mythology. But it resists the leap to assuming technological civilizations existed far earlier than current evidence supports. From their perspective, the excitement around lost civilization theories risks overshadowing the real, documented achievements of known prehistoric cultures, from the intricate seafaring of Polynesians to the stone artistry of Neolithic Britain. Yet even the most cautious scholars admit that our understanding of prehistory is incomplete. Much of the continental shelf remains unexplored, and new discoveries, such as Gobekli Tepe, have already challenged long-standing assumptions about when and how complex social organization began. While skeptics maintain that such sites fit within the gradual evolution of human society, they also acknowledge that future finds could revise the timeline. One off-topic example that illustrates this openness is the recent discovery of sophisticated stone architecture beneath the jungles of Guatemala, built by the ancient Maya. LiDAR scanning revealed entire city networks previously hidden from view. Such technological leaps in exploration could, in theory, do the same for submerged landscapes, uncovering unexpected traces of early human achievement. In the end, the skeptic's lens is both a restraint and a safeguard. It reminds us that speculation must remain tethered to evidence, that pattern recognition is not proof, and that human imagination can sometimes outrun the facts. But it also leaves room, however small, for surprise, should future research reveal something genuinely paradigm-shifting beneath the waves. From here, the journey turns once more to the unknown. The final chapter looks beyond debates and evidence to the enduring mystery of what the waters might still hide, and why the question of lost civilizations continues to resonate, even in an age of satellites and deep-sea robots. Beneath the ocean's restless surface lies a second Earth, a shadow world of plains, valleys, mountains, and canyons hidden from human eyes. It is a realm where light does not reach, where currents sculpt the land in slow silence, and where the ruins of the past, if they exist, lie sealed under centuries of silt. Even now, in an age of satellites, GPS, and submersible drones, vast stretches of this underwater world remain unmapped in detail. In that absence of knowledge, the question lingers: what do the waters still hide? The factual truth is stark. More than 70% of Earth's surface is covered by water, yet less than a quarter of the seafloor has been mapped at high resolution. The continental shelves, where most human activity would have been during the Ice Age, are especially underexplored. In some regions, political boundaries, security concerns, and economic priorities keep detailed surveys from being shared or even undertaken. In others, the sheer technical difficulty of excavation in deep, murky, and shifting waters limits what can be done. Historians still debate whether we will ever be able to fully recover whatever archaeological record lies on those drowned lands. Organic materials decay quickly in oxygen-rich shallow waters, and heavy sedimentation can bury sites beyond easy reach. Yet there are also places such as the anoxic depths of the Black Sea, where preservation can be extraordinary, with wooden ship hulls and even textiles surviving for millennia. If such conditions cover ancient settlements, their recovery could revolutionize our understanding of prehistory. One strange but illustrative off-topic discovery came in 2014, when researchers surveying the North Sea for wind farm construction stumbled upon evidence of a Stone Age hunting camp preserved beneath meters of sediment. Alongside animal bones and tools were hints of structures, a reminder that even routine engineering work can uncover pieces of the submerged world. The hypothesis that captivates those searching for lost civilizations is that somewhere, under a bay, a gulf, or a stretch of continental shelf, lies the remains of a place that does not fit the current timeline, a harbour with worked stone quays thousands of years older than any known city, or a cluster of buildings with an architectural style that appears fully formed without precedent. Such a find would not just extend history, it would rewrite it. Yet the skeptic's caution remains. Until such a site is found, the idea is only speculation, and so the ocean becomes a paradox, both the keeper of secrets and the impenetrable veil. What it hides may be the final missing chapters of our past, or only what we already know, rearranged and scattered. The act of searching becomes part of the human story itself. Historians still debate the motivations behind our fascination with the idea of civilizations lost to the sea. Is it nostalgia for a golden age that never was? A projection of our own fears about climate change and rising waters? Or is it something deeper? A recognition that we ourselves are temporary? That even our greatest cities could one day vanish beneath waves, leaving only fragments for someone else to puzzle over? From the first chipped stone tools to the glass towers of today, human achievement has always been at the mercy of nature's scale. Floods, earthquakes, volcanoes, and tides have erased as much as they have revealed. The ocean, more than any other force, has been both a provider and a destroyer, shaping where we live, how we travel, and what we remember. Somewhere, perhaps, there is a coastline untouched by nets and propellers, where an ancient wall still stands against the current, where streets of stone lead nowhere, and where fish dart through doorways built by human hands long before the sea arrived. Or perhaps there is nothing. No Atlantis, no lost cities, just the slow, patient work of water over rock. Either way, the waters still hide the answer, and the search, whether driven by science or story, ensures that we keep looking. The tide is eternal, its rhythm older than history. As the waves fold over the shore, they carry grains of the past. Sand once part of a mountain, perhaps once part of a home, a road, or a temple. The sea takes, but it also keeps, holding the fragments of time in a quiet, weightless archive. Now, as our story drifts to its end, the questions remain, but the urgency fades. The landscapes we have walked in imagination, the drowned plains, the sunken walls, the lost harbours, dissolve back into the deep. The debates of scholars, the dreams of explorers, the warnings of myth all merge into the soft sound of water on stone. If the answers lie beneath the waves, they will wait. The ocean is patient. Its memory is longer than ours, and so we leave it there, in the hush between tides, the possibility of another chapter still unwritten, still sleeping under the surface. Good night.